let's begin. What is your own philosophy on this Nigerian identity?
Well, there is nothing like Nigerian identity for now. You have Yoruba identity, you have Hausa identity or Hausa Fulani identity, which is, by the way, beginning to unravel. You have the Nupe identity, the Shekiri identity, you have the Igbo identity, you have many ethnic and nationalities within the context and the country called Nigeria. And Nigeria has not been able to form that Nigerian identity. And then I think there has been effort, or at least lip service efforts, by leaders to try to form that identity. But there has been that kind of failure to do that. And so, in the absence of that, I think the Nigerian identity largely exists only on paper.
Wow, interesting. But you know, sometimes there are questions that will be asked. Oh, sometimes most of our people who travel abroad, I mean, when they say, oh, they are Nigerians, there's this special attention that is being given to them, especially probably in embassies, and all of that abroad when they accuse and yeah, this person is a Nigerian. There's this special, time that is being, given to this person to check, make the person to ask more questions, all of this. And this brought down to the questions of, why is this so? Why do you argue that the operational and governance structures of Nigeria are imposed?
Okay, so you asked two questions. So the first question, I'll liken it to a school teacher. Close your eyes and imagine a school teacher who just resumed to teach a nursery school or a pre-nursery school today. And all the kids are crying the same, all their faces look the same. She can't or he can't, for any discernible reason, find the differences between A and B. So all of them look the same to him. But eventually, when he begins to stay or she begins to stay in that class and begin to form bonds with those children, she will begin to now identify each cry from the other. She will begin to identify even each handwriting for the other. Sometimes you can even begin to identify once she's not around and somebody does something in the class, she can point to a fair degree of accuracy who did what. That's it. So many Westerners or many foreigners are unable to distinguish between Nigerians. So they are unable to distinguish, for instance, between Yoruba Nigerians and Hausa Nigerians or Fulani Nigerians. Once they see that green passport, and by the way, you know that Nigeria does not have a good reputation out there for now. We will clean it up
Yeah.
eventually. And so once they see that green passport, their
Well,
ears,
sorry. Let me bring it again. You said we will clean it up eventually.
yes, I believe strongly
What
that.
what what year? What year is that?
Well, I believe that as Nigeria begins to get its acts together, that eventually people will love to associate with Nigerians because yes, the quality of the minds you have here are quite enormous. Of course, the resilience of the people is the Nigerians are making impact world over. The problem
because I,
now.
I because I remember growing up, they say we are the leaders of tomorrow, and I don't know if that tomorrow is here.
Oh well, I'm not here to console you, but then that tomorrow I don't believe it's behind us.
Okay, okay. Please go ahead.
Yes, so then the second question then now is why do I think that the Nigerian or the modern state construct is imposed?
Yeah.
Many people who are listening to us today may have heard of the Berlin Conference. And for those who have not heard of it, a simple Google search will give you a lot about Berlin Conference. So you do know that the history of Nigeria and the history of many African states did not begin in the 1900 or did not begin in 1914. Many people don't know this. Before the first white man ever set foot on Africa, Benin City, you know now, that are struggling with roads, had functional street lights. Many people don't know this. Benin City, you know, the Benin Empire had functional street lights, paved roads. They did. Google it. You had the
Yeah.
Sokoto Empire, you have several empires, you have several kingdoms. Yes, some of these kingdoms may be at war with each other. Sometimes they do inter-tribal wars, they do community trades, there are a lot of things, but the society had a structure. And so what you did was that you wanted to bring down the caliphate, which, by the way, the caliphate is also new compared to the history of the Hausas. You try to bring down the Boronu Empire, bring down the Caliphate, bring down the many kingdoms you have in the southeast, in the southwest, and force them into one national identity. And that identity, not even identity, is an operational extension of a mining or of a resource harvesting field. So, for the ease of administration, you do know that many scavengers, by scavengers, I mean some of the people who you call explorers who left their shores in Europe trying to find resource materials, trying to find mineral resources, raw materials to power the industrialization that was going on back home. They were also looking for human materials in terms of slaves to power the farming and then all of those things that was going on back in their societies. So these people began to sail to Africa. They did not meet Africa like this. They met kingdoms. They met an empire in Badagry. They met, you have to read up these things. So when they came, they began to fight amongst themselves. If you look, for instance, where you call Cameroon today, there's a part of Cameroon that is French speaking. There's a part of Cameroon that is English speaking. And it's for a reason. Because some parts of Cameroon were occupied by France. Some part of Cameroon were occupied by England, Britain. There are some that were occupied by, so some of the places in Africa where you hear Dutch language were people occupied by Germany. Some of the people, places, no, Germany was not part of it, but Portugal was. That explains why places like this country now that is rich in oil speaks Portuguese language. All right, so they began to fight amongst themselves as to who should take operational control of what territory. And France began to go to war against Britain as to who should take part of Cameroon. Britain against this. So they were fighting amongst each other until they now come together in what they called Berlin Conference to say, look, instead of fighting each other over this vast array of people, over this vast array of mineral resources, why don't we sit down and agree? Okay, they now drew a map. This map is now called Nigeria. Britain, take over it. This part is now called Cameroon. This side of Cameroon should remain with Britain. This side should remain with France. Where you now call Niger, oh yeah, France, take it. Where you now call, so all of those French-speaking countries were ceded to France. Some were ceded to Belgium. You know that Congo was ceded to Belgium. So, so what you now call map of Africa was not drawn with Africa in mind. It was drawn because two or three brothers were fighting over who would take what territory. And so they drew up this map according to their own administrative ease of extracting minerals and extracting slaves. So we're now on a commercial break, and then after the break, we will continue to draw the line from where it started to where we are now and to how we can remedy the situation. So please stay on the line.
Before we went on that break, commercial break, we were talking about, coming down from British colonization, colonizing Nigeria, down to how John how it's been so far. And I was trying to explain that Nigeria and its people have come a long way, from the days of British colonizing us and the years of indigenous rule, through the military takeovers and democratic rule, and a whole lot. And saying that Nigeria has really, really survived highs and those moments with hope of a better tomorrow. And I ask the question, this question of better tomorrow, when they say we are the leaders of tomorrow, when would that tomorrow come? But then different leaderships have come and gone with promises of a better future, but that future has remained elusive. Now the question is, which way Nigeria?
So,
What
so,
way
so,
is that for us?
Thank you for your question. And I don't want to live in the past. And anyone who has followed me knows that I don't live in the past. But then, if you don't have understanding of the past, you may have difficulties arriving at your future. So, like I was saying, I talk about what you said that we've come a long way. And then because what you're trying to do is to build an impossible task. And this is where it gets so frustrating because you have seen that it's not about military administrations because we have had a lot of them. You've also seen that it's not about democratic administrations because we've had a lot of them. You've also not seen that it's not about having from the north or from the south. We've also had a lot of that, and it has not solved the problem because the problem is more fundamental than merely changing a president. Let me take you, for instance, now. If you go to Europe and what you call Europe today, and try to, for instance, merge Britain with France and with Germany and call them one country and see how they will end up destroying each other. But you can have loose federations. They are countries of their own, independent. Now, some of you may not know that if you merge the population of Britain, merge the population of Germany, and merge the population of France, which are, by the way, contiguous to each other, if you merge the population and the land mass, it is not up to what you call Nigeria today. But these three countries cannot sit eye to eye if you call them one country, and especially if you put them in the kind of democratic experiment we call Nigeria. I'll ask you again, close your eyes for a minute and lump up Pakistan with India, call them one country, and then tell them to go and practice democracy. They will try it for 150 years, it will still not work. So I am not advocating for a monolithic society because you can't find one. But what you can find is that there are identities. Identities are always at each other's throat. They always compete. But there are identities that are easier to manage. There are differences that are easier to manage. I've told you, for instance, that a typical Hausa man, Fulani man, finds it easier to relate with someone from Niger than they do from someone from the southeast. That you can't take that away. This is 200 years of documented history has told us that. A typical Yoruba man may feel more at home with a Togolese or with a Beninese than they do with some people from across the ocean, across the sea, the river, the Niger. And that is a given fact. So if you are going to draw up state identities or state constructs, you must bear in mind the propensity of the people to live with each other. There are identities, yes, they compete, but they can harmonize to achieve a common goal. And it is on the basis of those identities that you now draw up new state constructs. For instance, we can now say, okay, what if we now say in a hypothetical situation where you merge part of northern Nigeria with Cameroon, part of northern Cameroon and part of northern Chad and part of northern Niger? Or you merge part of where you call Benin Republic with Badagry and all of those places. Or you merge the southeast, the south-south, plus parts of where you call southern Cameroon. Those are easier identities to manage. But the modern state construct, and what I'm telling you is not about Nigeria alone. If you go to Congo, you see this. If you go to Eritrea, you see this. There are more than, out of the 54 African countries, more than 50 of them have armed and potent identity-based conflicts. Some of those conflicts are now in a place where they are at each other's throat. For instance, there's a brewing crisis in Congo. For instance, there is an ongoing crisis in Oromia region of and the Tigray region of Ethiopia. There are ongoing, that some of these crises are being discussed that if you don't take time, Africa could see very armed and dangerous confrontations between now and the next 10, 25 years. This is destabilizing. Back to the questions you asked about the many experiments we've had. I think that if we don't understand that this is sometimes that for instance, some public policies we pursue are public policies we pursue because we distrust each other. Why has there been no functional port, for instance, in the eastern region? It is because of the distrust of Nigeria for such region, for that region. Where is there no functional? And again, we know that the ports in Lagos is suffocating Lagos because Lagos infrastructure is not enough to accommodate the many imports and the many exports that go on in Nigeria. But we have refused to divest from Lagos. Even those that we successfully put up in Undone, we have refused to allow it full operational capacity because of this mutual distrust. And so Lagos is suffering today under the heavy burdens of the many containers because of mutual distrust. Again, I'm telling you that because of this hyper competition between Hausa, Igbos, Yorubas, and all of those things, Nigeria can largely, yes, yeah, we can make some progresses at the seams, but until you solve that mutual distrust and identity and equation, then there is largely going to be an inhibition before you.
All right. All right. Chima, thank you so much for what I would call an introduction to the subject. I know that we discussed it before sometime in April. So this is like the second edition talking about the theory of nations as far as Africa is concerned. And many times I've listened to you speak on different programs talking about the issue of identity. And you made a point about the fact that it would seem that the average Fulani man who lives in northern Nigeria can maybe very well relate more with another Fulani man who lives in Nigeria Republic or some other part of Africa than someone from the southwest or someone from the southeast. Because of course this is an identity issue. That's someone that you can relate with. And you also made a reference to the Berlin Conference about how the borders in Africa were artificially drawn by some people who thought that they have the power to do that. But it's been many years since then. I mean, so many decades, maybe half a century, if you want to say. And why is it that the African continent or Africans in general have not done enough to correct the problems or the ills of the so-called Berlin Conference? Because if we keep talking about it as though that was the genesis of some of the issues that we face as a continent, why is it that the leaders and the people in that continent who now have the freedom to decide for themselves their own present and their own future have not been able to do so much in terms of reversing some of these problems, if you may call them that?
Oh, so some of those issues have to do with timing. Again, you see that there's a progression, natural progression of nation states and nations. So I think we found the earlier, for instance, independence guys, the many key political actors of 1960s, both in Nigeria, you know, cannot talk about Tafawa Balewa's, Nnamdi Azikiwe's. I think Awolowo can be included in that. And then Nahoro, if you move beyond Africa, you will talk about Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and all of those things. I think that they had this understanding that although this is an unworkable union, but let's see what we can make out of it. And Tanzania quite did something in Tanganyika, about Tanzania trying to form a national identity, trying to suppress some languages, trying to, because you have to literally kill Yoruba to build Nigeria. And that was the experiment they tried to do in Tanzania. So a lot of us felt that we can create new identities. But now, after doing it for nearly 60 years, we are beginning to see that that may be a very difficult task for us to do. People are now beginning to realize. And that is why if you look all around you now, especially between the last 20 years, you begin to see, not just in Nigeria, but even in Nigeria, there are at least three open talks about parting ways. You hear it with Oduduwa Republic, you hear it with Biafra, you hear it with the Middle Belt. Outside of Nigeria, these are there. You hear it in the Congo. You hear, okay, of course, you've seen the issues with Sudan and South Sudan. There are discussions like that in Ghana. Cross over to Cameroon, there is this, in fact, there is armed confrontation and war going on because of this in Cameroon. Go around many parts of Africa, many people are now beginning to see, and they are discussing these issues with the barrel of the gun. Because for some time, when especially in the kind of democracies you have in Africa, where there are some kinds of discussions that are outlawed, that you don't allow moderates to come together to say, where are the nation states, where are the elders, where are the leaders of these countries? Let us come together to call it a Cairo conference, an Abuja conference, to say, look, we have tried this and it's not working. Let us see if we can redraw the map. Of course, those are going to be very difficult conversations because even conversations between redrawing the maps of states are very difficult, let alone redrawing the maps of nation states. They are very, very difficult conversations. But the thing is that the conversation is already ongoing, and sometimes they are ongoing in the barrel of the gun. Look at what is happening with Oduduwa Republic. If you don't manage that properly, give it 10 years, you will see something on your hands. The discussion about Biafra, you've seen how it's progressing. The discussion is almost starting up about the separation of the Middle Belt. It's starting now, and if you don't pay attention. So, if you study this brewing crisis all over Africa and especially in Nigeria, you will see that it is now time that people are now fighting these issues with the barrel of the gun. But eventually, after outdoing each other, because I sense that wars will break out in Africa in less than 15 or 20 years. Anybody who has studied national progression will know this. And then you see this with, of course,
That's a
between
very bold projection.
well, if you read, it's easy to predict the future if you study the past. You don't have to have genius. It's a cycle. And once you begin to see cycle, every conflict is predictable. Every conflict without fail is predictable. If you begin to study the patterns and history, you will now see, oh, this is leading up to a conflict. And that was why some people said, oh, Nigeria will be this way in this way. So people, if we can predict population growth, if we can predict economic growth, well, there are predictors to conflicts, and we are saying that many of these predictors are now in the red zone. That if you give it time and give it the same circumstances, that Africa will end up on each other's street. But then, after that conflict, or after those conflicts, it will still come back to political table because very rarely do you see wars end in the battlefield. Many wars end in the boardroom. So, yes, the boardroom discussions will be impacted by something that is going on in the field. But eventually, Africa will come back together to say, look, we have fought for so long. We are now tired of killing each other. Can we now discuss how we can manage these unions? Where they are manageable, we'll continue to manage it and redraw the structure. Where they are not manageable, we can begin to part ways. You will see those discussions in less than 2 decades in Africa. That's my projection.
Very interesting. Now, Chima, let me take you back still on discussing Africa and its borders. I'm sure that you're aware of the AFCT, that's the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Yes.
Some countries signed it. It seems from my observation that has been very unworkable for so many years. It's still very difficult for Africans to trade amongst themselves, even though you see that they have artificial borders. And it's another fact that to travel across Africa, whether you're a Nigerian, a Zambian, a Ghanaian, to some other part of Africa is an Herculean task, unlike what you would have traveling across Europe or traveling across North America. So I think that maybe African leaders themselves are not doing enough to say that, okay, we're supposed to be one people in that sense, and we're supposed to be without borders in that sense. So this is what we're doing in the area of ensuring that we have business transactions in a seamless way amongst each other. That's where AFCT comes in. But when you look at the implementation across countries, it's nothing to write home about. So what would you put this on? Is it a problem of leadership, or maybe the agreements were not properly scrutinized, and maybe some countries feel that, oh, this is not going to be in our own benefits. Remember, under the previous administration, we had border shots, and they affected the economy of Ghana, affected the economy of Benin Republic, even affected the economy of Togo, as the case may be. And even under this administration, we've seen the same case as regards at Niger, where the president said that, oh, they need to shut their borders because a coup d'etat had happened there. And time again, we see this happening. Only in recent times have we seen some countries say, oh, we are going to allow some other Africans to come to our country peacefully, or they can stay for a period of 100 days, depending on the scenario of the case, like we've seen in Kenya, we've seen in Rwanda. But not many Africans are adopting this approach. So we still have that maybe generation of mistrust amongst each other, as the case may be. Like I asked before, would you put this at the feet of the leaders or the people themselves? Or is this by design?
Wow, there is something that is called slow adoption, all right? And by the way, I'm a champion of African Continental Free Trade Agreement. In fact, my vision for Africa is to have smaller nation states, right? And then a stronger union. For instance, you could have smaller nation states like you have in Europe, and you can now have an African Union where we can now do intra-country trade within each other, where we can now do a lot of things within each other. So lose nationality or smaller countries, breaking up into manageable units and sizes. But then on the issue of trade, on the issue of military, on the issue of economic collaboration, you now have loose agreements between those independent nation states. That's my vision for Africa. And that's why people like us will always support, for instance, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. However, you would see that that Continental Free Trade Agreement is still new. No matter how much we will it, a baby is still a baby. This baby is less than 10 years old and it cannot perform the magic of an adult. So you will see that slow adoption, but the conversations are continuing and we're seeing more countries sign up with this. Then the secondly is that the present leaders of Africa, how were they trained? They were trained with these colonial curricula and they can't do much. That's why they fight and kill to protect boundaries that they did not draw. For instance, the civil war that happened in Nigeria was a result of people fighting and killing each other to protect a boundary that they did not draw. All right, and they did not ask themselves, is this boundary beneficial to us? So you still have leaders who were trained under that colonial mindset. And that is why, first of all, one of the things we're going to do is to decolonize our education curricula to begin to think like original Africans. That way we could have leaders who are thinking originally and prescribing original diagnosis to the problems of Africa. That way they can prescribe solutions that are in tune with our realities. I think that if you give us time, that Africa will do well. I believe so because this generation of leaders can't do beyond their education. Some of them have this old mindset that was implanted in them. But we now have to, because look, we will have leadership needs in 2035. We will have leadership needs in 2045. No matter how you think of it, these leaders today cannot cross 15, 20 years from now. New leaders will emerge, and we should be worried about the training and the curricula of those new leaders. What kind of universities did they go to, and were they trained there? What kind of conferences did they attend? What kind of ideologies do they have? If they have Western ideologies, then they will be fighting and killing each other to preserve those things. If you train them with liberal African mindset to critically examine all truths, and then arrive at their own conclusions, where we may begin to see, and I am hopeful that we will begin to see a new brand of African leaders. Now, something is happening in the three African countries that have young military leaders. It's too early, and including in Senegal, it's too early to say that, okay, to rejoice, but we're still gathering data from those four experiments between the three non-democratic West African nations, and then the new leadership in Senegal. If we give them 5, 10 years, we can begin to predict, oh, it seems as if there is now a bold new young leadership in Africa. It's too early to say, but again, I will not be not expecting it to happen.
Very interesting. And let's come back to Nigeria now. I'm sure that you must have come across that many Nigerians who are listening to us would have had that popular saying from back in the day, saying that, oh, we need to be a detribalized Nigerian. So that means that when you present yourself at public forum, when you want to introduce yourself, you don't introduce yourself as Yoruba, as Igbo, as Yoruba, as Hausa, as Fulani. Just say I'm a Nigerian. So then there seems to be an attempt, an agenda to de-emphasize ethnic identities. But you argue that that should not be the case. That there should be Nigerians or Africans should be able to say that maybe Igbo first before I'm Nigerian, or I am Yoruba first before I'm Nigerian, or I'm Hausa first before I'm Nigerian. So my question to you is that are you not championing the promotion of ethnic identities or the promotion of ethnic supremacy over national cohesion in the context of Nigeria?
No, no. If ethnic supremacy is quite different from ethnic identity. No, ethnic supremacy means that, oh, we are Germans and we are superior to the rest of the world. We have a blue blood in us. We are Yorubas, we are superior. We are Igbos, we are more intelligent. We are Fulanis, we are born to rule. That's ethnic superiority. That's different from identifying that this person is a little bit different and unique in their own way. And when you talk about a detribalized Nigerian, I'm asking you, where else in the world have you found a detribalized person? Have you found a detribalized American? Have you found a detribalized European? Many Europeans are more tribal than Africans. Have you found a detribalized German who will still not look at a Brit like he's a Brit? Even in the United Kingdom, a Welshman is still a Welshman. An Irishman is still an Irishman. And so you must recognize these identities and you can find way. Recognizing them does not mean that you can cooperate. But you have to recognize that these identities exist and then you have to respect them. Now, what you mean by detribalized Nigeria is that you have to banish Yoruba and give us a common language, which is what they have successfully done in some of those places. And are we going to, for instance, is it a wonderful proposal for Yorubas to exchange their Yoruba identity, Yoruba culture, Yoruba food with Nigerian identity? So we're now going to all be speaking English, or we look at all the three languages and adopt one, or we go to the north where you know that we have the northern part of Nigeria, where you know that we have more than 180 different languages. Are we going to kill all of them and then uphold Hausa as the one language? Because that's the unifying mark, because language is one of the unifying markers and totems of identity. Culture is also a part of it. Are we going to kill the Yoruba culture so that we can erect the pan-Nigerian culture? So those are conversations. So if you look at what we call tribalism in Africa, it manifests itself as racism in other parts of the world. And these are potent problems. You can't go to China today. You can't go to, find any place in the world and tell me that you will not go and find identity-based crisis. People looking at each other, anybody that is a little bit different from them, they begin to suspect them. So these things are bound to be. And I'm telling you today that in my studies, you may not agree with me, but I found out that these problems were as a problem for people who were Bible scholars that started from that Tower of Babel. Since that Tower of Babel, man has continued to look at each other with deep-seated suspicions. And Yorubas will continue to look at Igbos with deep-seated concern. Now, you can find one or two people who, through the education of their soul, not going to Harvard, because we've seen many professors who are more tribalistic than even ordinary people. So it is not a function of how many degrees you have. All right. If you see the political actors of today, they were exposed. They were all. Many of them have been to more than 30 different countries, lived their lives abroad. So they are not in any way people who were living all their lives in the village. They are cosmopolitan by every standard. Yet, you have not beaten them out of their tribal nature. There are many Americans, they are cosmopolitan. They've traveled widely, but you can't beat them out of their racism. Now, you can find one or two people in a given population of 200 million people, for instance. You can find between 2 to 3 million or 5 million who have transcended beyond those barriers. But the majority of the people are still going to act in those instincts. And that's what I'm saying now. Instead of trying to mass educate 200 million people or 220 million people, why don't we find ways to say, okay, an Hausa man is different from an Igbo man, but can we erect a rule-based system where even if it's an Hausa man, that Igbo man will not feel left out of the system. Even if it's a Yoruba man, that Igbos will not feel left out of the system. Even if it's an Igbo man that is at the presidency or at the helm of affairs, that Yorubas will not feel left out. That is why you have this mistrust. And instead of trying to build a pan-Nigerian identity, why don't you build a rules-based system, which is easier to achieve in my own view? And that is what you have in Europe. Because there are laws, there are anti-discrimination laws, and they are enforced. That's what we want to see. That, for instance, in Nigeria, you have what you call, I think, federal character principle. But federal character principle in our constitution is a mere recommendation. There is no punishment for that. There is no punishment for that. So what I'm saying now, can we go to that federal character principle and now distill it and say this is now a punishable offense? If Igbos are voting in Lagos and someone wakes up and tell them go to your place, it is a punishable offense. So those are some of the things we are going to. But as for Yorubas will continue to distrust the Igbos. I'm sorry, the majority of the population will still always succumb to ethnic appellations.
Interesting. Now, there's a question around diversity. If you read some scholarly work, yeah, some people will argue, and sometimes I tend to maybe want to find the arguments about the fact that maybe our diversity as a nation could be a problem. It is their own proposition or their postulation that if we were a country that maybe spoke just one language or at most two, in maybe in the south and the north, development could have been accelerated faster and would have been able to cooperate to take giant strides, unlike what we have, where we have so many languages and dialects. Do you subscribe to that thought that maybe diversity could be somewhat like a drawback, a limitation?
So there's a research work I've seen that the most diverse teams, this is in the corporate world, that in where you find very many diversities within the team, that the team seems to be more productive. So diversity in itself is a blessing, not a curse. But then diversity, if it is not managed, can be a potential curse, if you may use that word. All right. So, and let me go back to Europe because that's the continent that I found that did something interesting. You remember the First World War, what they call World War? We know it's not a world war, it's just European brothers fighting each other. You also remember the Second World War, what they call Second World War. It's just Europeans fighting each other. Then, if you read the history of Europe before and the First World War, you will see that they were scattered. Germany was not even a country of its own. All right. How did Germany become a country? It's an interesting story. All right. But then it's not something we can tell today, but people who are interested can read it up. But what I'm seeing is that diversities are going to be there. But if you can manage it into smaller chunks, they are better off. So Europe is, I hope you know that just 3 or 4 countries in Africa will take care of the whole of Europe in terms of population and also in terms of landmass.
So, yes.
So why then imagine if you lump up Europe as 3 different countries or 4 different countries at most and tell them, oh yeah, begin to love each other and trust each other. See how that will end. And that is what we're doing in Africa. They have lumped up different identities. And then these are very competing identities. Now, sometimes if you have that unitary structure, you could have a loose structure that allows each region to grow at its pace, which was what 1963 Constitution achieved. And that's why a lot of Nigerians are angling and yearning to go back to 1963 Constitution because Yorubas or the Southwest region was growing at its pace. The Southeast region was growing at its pace. The South Northern region was growing at its pace. Now, where you cannot have that ideal situation in my mind, which is to discuss the boundaries of Nigeria, where you can't have that, you can now discuss the structure of Nigeria to say, look, let's have a unitary system. Did you know that before the dismantling of 1963 Constitution, the Southeast had embassies abroad? The West had embassies abroad. The North had embassies abroad. So the Southwest could negotiate trade deals with Portugal. The Southwest could negotiate trade deals with Germany, with Britain. Today, it is one structure negotiating for Nigeria. I'll give you this last example. On the issue of Palestine, which was just voted the other day, on the issue of Palestine or Gaza Israel conflict, there is no Nigerian consensus on that. Do you know that?
Yes, I do.
There's no Nigerian consensus. Depending on what region you go to, you see the countries they are supporting. But now we have a president and a Minister of Foreign Affairs who has to go to United Nations and vote for Nigeria and then vote according to sectional interests. Are you seeing the problem now? It's just all over there for us to see. But then back home, you also see that Yorubas may not be able to develop as much as they want to because they have to subscribe under a unitary system that has now been captured to serve the interest of Fulanis. That Igbos may not be able to fully develop because they are under a unitary system that has been captured to serve the interest of, say, Hausas for the next 8 years. So that is the problem, that whereas we have a country called Nigeria, can we loosen the structure a bit and allow the regions to operate at their pace? Maybe that way we could stop fighting each other and killing each other and on some of those identity-based grounds. And in fact, stifling each other's growth because the Yorubas don't want the Igbos to grow, they too themselves will not grow. Because Fulanis don't want others to grow, they too themselves will not grow. You now see that this, what do you call it now? Diversity has now become an impediment. If you lose it up a little bit, your diversity could help you grow.
But the last lap of the show, we're talking about Nigeria now being a nation. Would you say Nigeria now is a nationhood or a statehood?
The question is very deep, and by the way, Nigeria is not a nation. We have Yoruba nation, we have Ijaw nation, we have Igbo nation, we have Hausa nation, we have Fulani nation. Nigeria is not a nation.
So are
And
you saying Nigeria is a statehood?
even in terms of statehood, Nigeria is now feeling as a state and may not purely qualify in the strictest definition of the word state. So, for the word to be a state, for you to be a state, you must assert territorial control over all your territories. Nigeria does not qualify for that. For instance, in parts of Nigeria, you have many spaces that are termed and deemed ungoverned. That's declining state capacity, right? Then in also other places, by the way, at the philosophical level, there has been this debate whether states should retain the monopoly of violence. So there's the theoretical level whether it is moral or just for the state to be the only tool of coercion, to retain the only tool of coercion. So that's been debated at the philosophical level. But at the operational level, it seems that Nigeria has answered the question, and it answers the question in clear no. For instance, you know about Tantita or Tantia group that is owned by government, that Tompolo and others. So in the South, you have that Nigeria is into power sharing with, we won't call them terrorists, we will call them, some of them do not qualify for freedom fighters, but I think the right word is militants. So you have that Nigeria is sharing its operational spaces with militants, and many times those militants have gone into active contracting for the federal government of Nigeria. That is declining state capacity, because the answer is that the Nigerian state does not have the capacity to inflict its will on that zone. That is why it must work with local stakeholders to be able to extract oil from that region. If you now go to Nasarawa State, for instance, the Commissioner of Information in Nasarawa State put out a press statement lampooning the federal government and talks about federal government going into negotiation with bandits. The state government says that the governor is not in any way going to accept any federal negotiation with bandits in his state. All right. So now we are beginning to have talks, though unofficial and sometimes partly official, about Nigeria going into discussion with bandits to see if we can now say, okay, bandits, you control this territory, but let's have an agreement. In the southeast today, there are some parts of Ihiala local government area of Anambra State that the state cannot tax. In fact, in the last elections in Anambra State, it is on official INEC record. INEC said we could not deploy ballot materials or polling balloting to these groups because of the presence of ESN and unknown government. So, which means that the Nigerian state has largely ceded that territory to unknown government. You cannot tax there. In Borno State, there are places where terrorists and non-state actors collect taxes from communities. So, with all these things, we are now saying that they are
In all of
now
this,
they are
in
what.
all of this, it's stated, in every country, in every state, there is one thing fighting the government. There is always one challenges or the other. Even in the United States, even in Russia, most of these Western countries, we have that. And does this now disqualify a nation?
No, no. So you're going to look at the nuances of the conflict. I don't think anybody can stop anybody from collecting taxes in any part of America. I don't think anybody can set up itself and be collecting taxes in any part of Britain. I don't think anybody, no matter how powerful, can set up and begin to organize and collect taxes in any part of France or Germany. Once you begin to see that happen, we call it declining state capacity. Now, it can still answer a state, but it has limited capacity. All right. So I want you to see that what we are painting is that because you asked me the question, is Nigeria a nation state, or a state? And I'm said that Nigeria is not a nation because obviously it's not a nation. But then even the statehood that we are still trying to manage, the small one that we're still trying to manage, it is slipping through our fingers by the day. And there is no region in Nigeria today, maybe apart from the southwest, that you won't find that Nigeria has ceded a large swath of its operational territory to non-state actors.
Well, okay. Sometimes I tend to wonder, I tend to argue with all of it. But lastly, before we let you go, and because of our time also, do you think the union of Nigerians across what you call artificial borders is sustainable?
No, the artificial borders is not sustainable, and we will soon find out. Either we find out peacefully or we find out through the wars that I've told you that are clearly coming. And so it is now left for the stakeholders to decide what pathway do we use. Do we use the dialogue pathway? For instance, you've been hearing talks and talks about changing of the constitution of Nigeria, but it seems like the political actors are tone deaf. And then very soon, those conversations will begin to ring loud in bullets. And it is only when it starts people start discussing in the bullets that authorities tend to listen. And by the time they do that, many resources must have gone down the drain. We hope that this is not the end of Nigeria. We hope that this is not the future Nigeria will choose for itself, that Nigeria will choose the path of common sense and renegotiate its union with all constituent parts of Nigeria. Because if you don't do that negotiation, you will now negotiate through the barrel. And I hope we don't choose that negotiation by the barrel.
Well, we also hope so too. I mean, it's been a wonderful eye opener from you there, Chima, Christian. Thank you very much for your time on the show.
Thank you so very much for having me. I deeply appreciate your time.
And we hope maybe soon as I mean we'll get to where you taught us, or where you always dream of. Because for me, I sometimes just say, okay, growing up, yes, we're the leaders of tomorrow. We are tomorrow. But then you wake up and you see that you're not even anywhere close. But well, you said it that as soon as we will
Yes,
get there.
soonest Africa's morning is at hand. That morning that I talk about will be preceded by a major structural change. And that major structural change can be peaceful or it can be violent. Either ways, that morning must come. So it's not a question of whether it will come, but it will be preceded by a major structural change. And so that structural change is the one that we have options to choose whether
Are
it
you
should be.
referring to the structural change that happened, one of the structural change that happened in Ghana?
Well, you've asked me very well. I'm not going to answer that question, but what I've said now is that a structural change is going to happen, and then it will happen. We now choose how it will happen, whether it will be peaceful or whether it will be violent, but something must give way. These countries, of course, can no longer continue the way it's being run. Look at the poverty rate. People are fed up, and very soon people will get tired of being afraid of people who are going to kill them when they protest. In fact, at some point, it will be you are doing Nigerians a favor if you're a military man and you kill them because there's no life worth living whatsoever. And once we get to that place, and Nigeria is fast heading to that place, you will see that the nation state will unravel. We hope it doesn't get to that our leaders listen to the voice of reason. But if they don't listen, it's a natural progression, it will happen.
All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so very much. Africa's morning is at hand.
All right, Lagos. I love
So yes, my closing argument is that if you look at what is happening in Africa, it's not sustainable. So for people who give up hope, maybe because you've not seen into the future. If you've seen into the future, we have two pathways. The first pathway is that there will be wars, and after the war, there will be a major reset. And then the second pathway is that the leaders navigate these things carefully and negotiate their way into a better union. I think that the first is the most likely, and the second is the most desirable. But then it could be a mixture of the two. But whatever happens, we do know that Africa's morning is at hand. Thank you so very much for listening, and I hope to see you in our subsequent interactions.